People don't usually lose their family in a single night. Most of the time, they lose them one assumption at a time, until nobody remembers when love stopped listening and judgment took its place. My name is Nathan Carter, and 5 years ago, my parents chose my wife over their own son without giving me a chance to explain. Looking back now, I can still remember every detail of that evening because it was the moment my old life ended. I had just returned home after a 3-day business trip for the engineering firm where I worked. I was exhausted but excited. Olivia had texted me that morning saying we should have dinner together because she wanted to talk about our future. I thought she was finally ready to discuss starting a family. I even picked up her favorite cheesecake on the drive home. The moment I stepped through the front door, I knew something was wrong. The living room was silent. My father, Robert Carter, stood near the fireplace with his arms folded across his chest. My mother, Patricia Carter, sat stiffly on the couch with red eyes, clutching a tissue. Olivia was crying in the corner. Before I could ask what had happened, my father spoke. "Tell us the truth, Nathan." I frowned. "The truth about what?" Olivia slowly looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Stop pretending," she whispered. "I know you've been seeing another woman." For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I noticed several printed photographs and screenshots spread across the coffee table. They showed me having dinner with a woman from work, laughing during a meeting, and walking into a hotel lobby together after a conference. None of it was romantic. Every event had been business-related. "This isn't what it looks like," I said, taking a step forward. Robert slammed his hand on the table. "Don't insult us with another lie." I stared at him in disbelief. "Dad, you haven't even asked me what actually happened." Patricia avoided my eyes. Olivia showed us everything. I picked up one of the screenshots. The messages were fake. They looked like conversations between me and a woman I barely knew, but I had never written those words. "These are fabricated," I said firmly. "Someone edited them." Olivia shook her head dramatically. "Why can't you just admit it?" My heart pounded. "Because I didn't do it." Nobody answered. The silence hurt more than any accusation. I looked from my father to my mother, searching for even the smallest sign that they trusted me enough to ask one question before reaching a verdict. There was nothing. Only disappointment, anger, and certainty. Robert pointed toward the front door. "Pack whatever belongs to you and leave." I felt the air leave my lungs. "You're throwing me out of my own home." "Not until you tell the truth." I swallowed hard. "I am telling the truth." Patricia finally stood, walked to the hallway, and quietly placed my house key in my hand before closing my fingers around it. Then, with tears running down her face, she took it back. That simple gesture shattered something inside me. I carried one suitcase to my car, while Olivia remained inside with my parents. Not one of them followed me outside. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The porch light slowly disappeared into the darkness, and with it, the family I believed would always stand beside me. That was the last night I ever called that place home. The hardest part about starting over isn't having nothing. It's accepting that the people who should have believed in you are no longer coming to save you. The first night after leaving my parents' house, I parked my car in the corner of a 24-hour grocery store parking lot. I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go and stared at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep. My suitcase sat beside me. The cheesecake I had bought for Olivia was still on the passenger seat, untouched. Around midnight, I picked it up, walked to a nearby trash can, and threw it away without opening the box. Somehow, that simple act hurt more than packing my clothes. The following morning, I called Olivia one last time. It went straight to voicemail. I sent a short message asking if we could talk face-to-face, hoping there had been some misunderstanding. She never replied. 2 weeks later, I was served with divorce papers. There was no personal letter, no explanation, just legal documents ending the marriage I had spent 6 years trying to build. I signed them without contest because I realized something painful. You can't fight for a relationship when you're the only one still standing in it. Since I couldn't afford my apartment after the separation, I sold most of my furniture, stored a few personal belongings in a rented storage unit, and continued sleeping in my car. During the day, I accepted every temporary construction job I could find. Roofing, concrete work, demolition, framing. None of it matched my previous office career, but honest work gave me something I desperately needed: purpose. One rainy afternoon, while helping renovate an old warehouse, I stayed behind after everyone else left to organize tools and clean the site. As I locked the equipment trailer, an older man approached me. His name was Frank Sullivan, the owner of the construction company. "You're still here?" he asked. I shrugged. The job wasn't finished. He smiled slightly. "Most people leave when the clock says they're done." Over the next several weeks, Frank kept assigning me more responsibility. Eventually, he asked me to supervise a small crew. I was surprised. "Why me?" I asked. He looked me straight in the eye. "Because you solve problems instead of creating them." Those words stayed with me. For the first time since losing my family, someone judged me by my character instead of rumors. Months turned into years. I earned certifications, learned estimating, project management, budgeting, and eventually became operations manager. Frank became more than my employer. He became the mentor I didn't know I needed. While my own father believed the worst about me without asking a single question, another man chose to trust me because of the person I proved myself to be every day. I slowly stopped checking my phone, hoping for an apology that never came. My parents never called. Olivia never reached out. I convinced myself that chapter of my life had finally ended. Then one afternoon, as I was leaving a construction supply store, I heard someone call my name. I turned around and saw an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in years. After a brief conversation, he hesitated before saying something that made my stomach tighten. "Nathan, I don't think your parents have any idea what Olivia has been hiding. The truth has a strange habit of surviving, even when everyone works hard to bury it. Sometimes it waits quietly for years until the right moment arrives." My old college friend introduced himself with the same easy smile I remembered from campus, but his expression changed the moment he mentioned Olivia. "Nathan," he said carefully, "I debated whether I should tell you this." We sat down at a small coffee shop across the street from the construction supply store. His name was Eric Lawson, and he had recently started working in the accounting department of a regional healthcare company. As it turned out, Olivia had worked there too. "I recognized her last year," Eric explained. "At first, I didn't say anything because your divorce wasn't my business." I nodded. "So why tell me now?" He leaned forward. "Because I accidentally learned something that changes everything." My chest tightened. Eric explained that Olivia had been involved in a relationship with one of her supervisors months before my marriage fell apart. At first, he had dismissed the office gossip. Then one afternoon, he overheard a conversation that made him freeze. Olivia had laughed about how easy it had been to convince everyone that I was the unfaithful husband. I stared at him, unable to speak. "I know how unbelievable that sounds," Eric continued. "But there's more." He pulled out his phone and opened a folder containing several publicly available court records from a civil lawsuit involving Olivia's former supervisor. During the investigation, old emails had been recovered from company servers. Some of them revealed conversations between the two discussing how they planned to leave their spouses. One message caught my attention immediately. Olivia had written, "My parents-in-law already believe whatever I tell them. Nathan won't even have a chance to defend himself." I read that sentence 3 times before handing the phone back. My hands were shaking. 5 years of unanswered questions suddenly had a direction. Eric looked at me carefully. "I thought you deserved to know." I thanked him sincerely, but as I drove away, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to confront anyone. I wasn't going to send the emails to my parents. I wasn't going to call Olivia. For years, I had built a peaceful life by refusing to live inside my anger. I wasn't about to surrender that peace now. If the truth ever reached my parents, it had to come from somewhere other than me. Meanwhile, life inside my parents' home was beginning to change in ways I couldn't see. Olivia had continued living with them for several years after the divorce because they considered her family. She often visited for dinner, celebrated holidays with them, and accepted their unwavering support. But little inconsistencies had started appearing. She became defensive whenever Robert asked simple questions about work. She took private phone calls outside. She dismissed conversations whenever finances came up. My father wasn't suspicious by nature, but even trust has limits when small lies begin piling on top of one another. One Saturday afternoon, while helping Olivia replace an old laptop she claimed had stopped working, Robert offered to transfer her files onto a new computer. She immediately refused and insisted she would handle it herself. It was the first time he had ever seen genuine panic in her eyes. Later that evening, after she accidentally left behind a portable backup drive in the guest bedroom, Robert picked it up, intending to return it. As he looked at the small black device resting in his hand, he had no idea it contained the first piece of evidence that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about the night his own son walked out the front door. The most painful discoveries aren't the ones that reveal someone else's lies. They're the ones that expose how willingly we ignored the truth. I didn't know any of this was happening while I was busy building my new life. Every morning, I showed up before sunrise, reviewed blueprints with my team, and watched projects that once existed only on paper slowly become reality. Frank often reminded me that strong buildings depended on solid foundations. I had begun to realize the same was true for relationships. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the foundation inside my parents' home had quietly started to crack. Robert couldn't stop thinking about Olivia's reaction when he had offered to transfer the files from her old laptop. She had never been secretive before. In fact, for years she had openly shared every frustration, every complaint, and every accusation against me. Yet a simple backup drive suddenly made her nervous. He didn't connect it to a computer that night. Instead, he placed it inside his desk drawer and tried to convince himself he was imagining things. But doubt has a way of growing once it takes root. 2 days later, Olivia called Patricia in tears, insisting she had misplaced an important external drive containing family photos and work documents. Her panic sounded far greater than the situation seemed to justify. After hanging up, Patricia mentioned the conversation to Robert. He quietly walked to his office, opened the drawer, and stared at the small device. "Maybe we should just give it back," Patricia suggested. Robert nodded, then hesitated. "Before we do, I need to answer one question." He connected the drive to his computer. Neither of them expected to find anything unusual. Instead, they discovered folders labeled with ordinary names that concealed dozens of archived screenshots, edited images, and saved message templates. Robert clicked one file after another in complete silence. Side-by-side comparisons showed original text conversations next to altered versions where entire sentences had been inserted or removed. Timestamps had been changed. Contact names had been manipulated. Even the screenshots Olivia had shown them 5 years earlier were stored in editable project files. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands. "No," she whispered. Robert kept opening documents. There were instructions explaining how to crop messages so metadata wouldn't appear. There were drafts of fake conversations. Then came an email addressed to one of Olivia's closest friends. It read, "Once his parents believe he's cheating, they'll force him out. After that, everything becomes easier." Robert leaned back in his chair as if the air had been knocked out of him. For the first time in 5 years, he replayed that terrible night in his mind. He remembered my face. He remembered me asking for one chance to explain. He remembered refusing to listen. Patricia began crying uncontrollably. Nathan kept saying the messages were fake. Robert couldn't answer. Every memory they had trusted was collapsing beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. Neither of them slept that night. The following morning, Olivia arrived for breakfast carrying her usual cheerful smile. Robert quietly placed the external drive on the dining room table. The color immediately drained from her face. Before she could say a single word, he looked directly into her eyes and asked the question he should have asked 5 years earlier. "Tell me the truth, Olivia. Did you destroy my son's life?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but for my parents, it felt like an entire lifetime. Then Olivia slowly lowered her head, and without offering a single excuse, she whispered the one word that shattered everything they believed. "Yes." Regret doesn't arrive the moment you discover the truth. It arrives when you finally understand the pain your choices caused someone you loved. Olivia's quiet confession echoed through the dining room long after she spoke that single word. "Yes." Robert felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. Patricia stared at Olivia with tears streaming down her face, searching desperately for some sign that this was another misunderstanding. "Tell me everything," Robert said, his voice calm but trembling beneath the surface. Olivia slowly lowered herself into a chair. The confidence she had carried for years was gone. She admitted that she had developed feelings for her supervisor months before my marriage ended. Instead of asking for a divorce honestly, she became afraid that everyone would judge her for destroying the marriage. So she decided to create a different story, one where I became the villain. She confessed to editing screenshots, deleting messages, and carefully choosing photographs from my business trips to make innocent situations appear suspicious. She even admitted she had counted on one thing above all else. "I knew you trusted me more than Nathan," she whispered. Patricia broke down completely. "He begged us to listen." Olivia nodded through tears. "I know." Robert closed his eyes, remembering every word I had spoken that night. I had never yelled. I had never insulted anyone. I had simply asked for one chance to explain. He was the one who refused. "Why didn't you tell us the truth afterward?" Patricia asked quietly. Olivia looked down at her hands. "Because every day it became harder. Once you believed me, I didn't know how to admit what I'd done." Robert stood and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had 5 years earlier. Children rode bicycles. A dog barked in the distance. Yet inside the house, everything had changed forever. "You need to leave," he said without turning around. Olivia looked stunned. "Robert, please leave." There was no anger in his voice anymore. Only exhaustion. She silently gathered her purse and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, she paused. "I'm sorry." Robert didn't answer. The door closed behind her, and the house felt strangely empty. Later that evening, Robert and Patricia sat together in the living room surrounded by old family photographs. There was one picture of me graduating from college, another from my wedding day, and one from a camping trip when I was 12 years old. Patricia picked up the wedding photo and whispered, "We threw away our son without asking a single question." Neither of them slept that night. The next morning, Robert contacted an attorney to confirm whether the recovered files were authentic. The attorney recommended an independent digital forensic specialist who verified that the edited screenshots had been manipulated years earlier and that the original files matched Olivia's confession. There was no longer any room for doubt. The betrayal they had blamed on me had never existed. Robert quietly folded the investigation report and placed it inside a large manila envelope. He looked at Patricia with tears in his eyes. "We've spent 5 years believing a lie." She reached for his hand. "Then it's time we face the man we abandoned." Robert nodded slowly, but his expression remained heavy. "Finding me wouldn't be difficult. The real question was whether I would even be willing to see them after everything they had done." He picked up his phone, searched for my company's website, and stared at the contact page for a long time before whispering the words he never imagined he would have to say. "I pray our son gives us one chance to apologize." An apology can't change the past, but a sincere one can reveal whether someone's heart has finally changed. Nearly 5 years had passed since I walked away from my parents' house with one suitcase and nowhere to go. During that time, I had built something I never expected. Frank eventually retired and sold me part of the construction company. Together with a small group of trusted partners, we expanded into commercial development. The frightened man who had once slept in his car had become someone responsible for dozens of employees and their families. I wasn't wealthy beyond imagination, but I had something far more valuable: peace. One Tuesday afternoon, my assistant knocked on my office door. "Nathan," she said gently, "there are 2 people here asking if they can speak with you. They said it's personal." I looked through the glass wall overlooking the reception area. My father sat with his hands clasped together, staring at the floor. My mother held a folded handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I had imagined this moment countless times during those lonely nights years ago. Back then, I wanted them to come looking for me. I wanted them to tell me they believed me. Now that they were finally here, I wasn't sure how I felt. I asked my assistant to bring them into the conference room. When I walked inside, both of them stood immediately. They looked older than I remembered. My father's shoulders seemed heavier. My mother's smile had disappeared entirely. Nobody spoke at first. Finally, Robert reached into his briefcase and placed a large manila envelope on the table between us. "We know the truth," he said quietly. I looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "About Olivia." I nodded slowly. "You found out." He swallowed hard. Too late. Those 2 words carried more weight than any speech he could have given. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "Nathan, we failed you." I remained silent. She continued, speaking through quiet sobs. "You kept asking us to listen, and we refused. We chose the easiest story instead of the true one." Robert looked directly at me for the first time. "I was supposed to protect you. Instead, I became the person who hurt you the most." The room fell silent again. I finally opened the envelope. Inside were copies of the forensic report, the manipulated screenshots, Olivia's written confession, and a handwritten letter from both of them. I didn't need to read any of it. I already knew I had been innocent. The evidence wasn't for me. It was for their conscience. My father slowly stepped closer. We're not here to ask you to forget. He paused, struggling to keep his composure. We're here because we finally understand what we took from you. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the two people who had once meant everything to me. Do you know what hurt the most? I asked. They both shook their heads. It wasn't losing Olivia. I took a slow breath. It was realizing my own parents believed a stranger's accusations before they believed the son they had raised for 35 years. Patricia covered her face and began crying. Robert closed his eyes. Neither of them tried to defend themselves. There was nothing left to defend. After several moments, I spoke again. I forgave both of you a long time ago. They looked up in surprise. Not because you deserved it, I continued. Because I refused to spend the rest of my life carrying that anger. My father whispered, does that mean you'll come home? I looked out the conference room window toward the job site where my employees were working together to build something new. Then I turned back to him and quietly answered, forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness opens the door to peace, but trust has to knock for a very long time before anyone lets it back inside. My father lowered his head after hearing my answer. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. For the first time in years, he simply accepted the consequences of his own choices. You're right, Robert said quietly. We don't deserve your trust. Patricia wiped away her tears and reached into her purse. She carefully placed a small object on the conference table. It was my old house key, the same one she had taken back from my hand the night they forced me to leave. I stared at it for several seconds without touching it. I've carried this every day, she whispered. I kept hoping I'd have the courage to return it. I looked at the worn brass key and felt memories rushing back all at once. The cold night, my packed suitcase, the empty parking lot where I spent my first night alone. For years, I had imagined this moment would heal everything. Instead, I realized it couldn't erase what had happened. I gently slid the key back toward her. Keep it, I said softly. Both of them looked confused. That house stopped being my home a long time ago. Patricia broke down again, but this time I walked around the table and hugged her. It wasn't because the pain had disappeared. It was because I no longer wanted either of us to carry it alone. My father hesitated before embracing me as well. His shoulders shook in a way I had never seen before. The strongest man I had known throughout my childhood was crying like a father who had finally understood what he had lost. We spent nearly 2 hours talking. They asked about my life, my company, and Frank, the mentor who had helped me rebuild everything from nothing. They listened more than they spoke. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify the past, only quiet acceptance. Before leaving, Robert asked one final question. Would you allow us to see you again? I thought carefully before answering. Yes. Relief spread across both of their faces. Then I added, but we start from where we are today, not from where we used to be. They both nodded immediately. Over the following months, our relationship slowly began to change. We met for lunch every few weeks. Sometimes we talked about business. Sometimes about childhood memories. Sometimes we simply sat together without discussing the past at all. Trust wasn't rebuilt through grand speeches. It returned through small, consistent actions. One afternoon, my mother quietly admitted something that stayed with me. Every birthday after you left, she said, I baked your favorite chocolate cake anyway. I smiled sadly. I spent most of those birthdays working late because it hurt less than celebrating alone. Neither of us spoke for several minutes after that. Healing often happened in silence. Around the same time, I began hearing occasional updates about Olivia through mutual acquaintances. After losing her job, her relationship with the supervisor had collapsed. Several friendships ended once people learned the truth behind our divorce. She had spent years building her future on deception, only to watch it slowly unravel. Some people expected me to feel satisfaction hearing those stories. Surprisingly, I didn't. Revenge had never repaired a broken heart, and someone else's downfall could never restore the years I had lost. Still, I couldn't help wondering whether our paths would cross one final time. As fate would have it, I didn't have to wait very long for that answer. Life has a strange way of bringing people back into your path, not to reopen old wounds, but to show you how much you've changed since they were made. A few weeks after my parents and I began rebuilding our relationship, I attended a charity fundraiser hosted by our local business association. My company had sponsored the renovation of a community youth center, and several business leaders had gathered for the event. I was speaking with one of our project managers when I noticed a familiar figure standing alone near the back of the ballroom. For a brief moment, I wasn't even sure it was her. Olivia looked different. She seemed thinner, older somehow, and the confidence that had once filled every room she entered had disappeared. Our eyes met across the crowd. She hesitated before slowly walking toward me. "Nathan," she said softly. I nodded politely. "Olivia." There was an awkward silence between us. 5 years earlier, I would have demanded answers. Now I simply waited. She looked down at the floor before speaking again. "I wasn't sure you'd even acknowledge me." "You said my name," I replied. "Ignoring you wouldn't change anything." She gave a faint, painful smile. "You've always been kinder than I deserved." We stepped outside onto the terrace where the evening air was cool and quiet. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I lost everything," she admitted. "My job, my relationship, most of my friends. Your parents won't even answer my calls anymore." I listened without interrupting. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was simply telling the truth for the first time in years. "I've replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times," she continued. "If I could take it back, I would." I looked out across the city lights before answering. "I believe you regret it." Her eyes filled with hope. "Does that mean?" I gently shook my head before she could finish. "No." She lowered her gaze immediately. "I'm not saying that to punish you," I continued. "I'm saying it because the life we had no longer exists." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I destroyed it." "Yes," I answered honestly. "You did." The words were painful, but they weren't spoken with anger. They were simply true. After a long silence, she asked the question I knew had been weighing on her heart. "Have you ever hated me?" I thought carefully before responding. For a while, I hated what happened to me. Eventually, I realized carrying hatred only kept me connected to the worst chapter of my life. She wiped away her tears. "So you've forgiven me?" "I've forgiven you enough to let go," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't always lead people back together." She nodded slowly. Deep down, I think she already knew the answer before asking. As we prepared to leave, she reached into her purse and removed my old wedding ring. I hadn't seen it since the divorce papers were finalized. She placed it gently into my hand. "I kept this because I never felt worthy of throwing it away." I closed my fingers around the ring for a moment before quietly placing it back into her palm. "It's part of your story now," I said. "Not mine." She looked at me through tear-filled eyes and gave a small, grateful nod. Without another word, she turned and walked away into the crowd. I watched her disappear, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Some endings don't need dramatic revenge. They simply need the courage to remain in the past, while you continue walking toward the future. As I drove home that night, I had no idea one final message was already waiting for me, a letter that would bring this journey to its true conclusion. People often ask me what happened after everyone finally learned the truth. They expect a dramatic ending where justice arrives all at once, where every broken relationship is magically repaired, and where every wound disappears. Real life doesn't work that way. Healing is much quieter than revenge. The morning after the charity event, I found a handwritten envelope waiting on my desk at the office. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Olivia. I sat alone before opening it. The letter wasn't long. She didn't ask me to come back. She didn't try to excuse what she had done. Instead, she wrote that she had spent years trying to understand why she had chosen lies over honesty. She admitted that fear had made her selfish, pride had kept her silent, and every day she delayed telling the truth only made the damage worse. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stayed with me. "I hope one day people remember you for the man I should have defended instead of the man I falsely accused." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I locked it in my desk drawer, not because I wanted to remember the pain, but because it reminded me how powerful one dishonest decision could become. A few months later, my parents invited me to dinner at their house. I hadn't walked through that front door since the night I left with my suitcase. As I stepped inside, everything looked familiar. The old family photographs still lined the hallway. My father's favorite chair remained in the corner of the living room. My mother's kitchen smelled exactly the way it had when I was a child. Yet somehow, the house felt different. Maybe it wasn't the house that had changed. Maybe it was me. During dinner, Nobody tried to pretend the past had never happened. We laughed about childhood memories, talked about work, and even shared stories about Frank, whose retirement had become one of the happiest chapters of his life. Before dessert, my father stood and quietly raised his glass. To second chances, he said. I smiled and gently shook my head. Not second chances, I replied. New beginnings. Everyone around the table smiled, and for the first time in many years, the silence between us felt peaceful instead of painful. As I prepared to leave that evening, my mother walked me to the front door. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Welcome home." I looked at the familiar porch where my life had fallen apart years earlier. Then I smiled softly. Home isn't a place anymore, I told her. It's the people who choose to love each other with honesty. She nodded through tears, finally understanding what those years apart had taught all of us. Looking back now, I don't see myself as the man who was betrayed by his wife or abandoned by his parents. I see myself as someone who discovered that character isn't defined by what people accuse you of. It's revealed by how you choose to live after your world falls apart. Losing everything forced me to build a better version of myself. My parents learned that trust should never replace truth. Olivia learned that lies always demand a price that becomes too expensive to pay. And I learned perhaps the greatest lesson of all. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It simply refuses to let the past decide your future. If my story has taught you anything, let it be this. Never judge someone before hearing their side, because one conversation can save a family, while one assumption can destroy it. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope you never have to walk the road I did. But if you ever do, I hope you remember that the darkest chapters of your life do not have to become the final page.